Nobody knows what's going to happen. They don't know how severe it's going to be, and they don't know how long the duration.
This is not a technical problem. This is a social problem. This is a new variety of failure, and it's the failure of complex systems.
It's not just a risk to computers, but a power supply or water supply, food, healthcare, etc.
Some of the possible outcomes, lawsuits. Okay, you really have to plan on that. Every single organization, any industry, should expect that they will be sued over year 2000 problems.
And then we have the domino effect, the interdependability of power plants upon the grid, and they're dependent upon the telecommunications to work. And if it's a coal plant, they're dependent upon the railroads, and the railroads are dependent upon the electric utilities.
Virtually all of the critical systems and services we depend on for daily existence rely on computer technology in some way. Blackout, communication failure, transportation disruption, breakdown of emergency services. All of these are real possibilities. In this program, we'll try to present some snapshots of all of these. Not end-to-end solutions, but facts and advice, observations and experiences, tactics for dealing with the critical issues like power, water, food, and communications. When we're done, hopefully you'll have some tools to help you make your decisions, to plan your course, to proceed with caution. In the early days of computing, when memory was expensive,
They started writing software in that. They just dropped the 2 digits in front of the year. Just like when we say 1998, we don't say 1998, we say 98. That's what computers do.
a short-term solution, they thought, easily remedied in the future. But later,
when programmers started developing new programs and the computers got more sophisticated, they didn't actually start necessarily writing code from scratch. They just started building on the code, the software that was already there.
And so two-digit dates are still in use in literally millions of computer systems today. The problem is, what comes after 99? 00, of course. But does that mean 2000 or 1900 or something unknown? It's really a simple problem to fix in one computer. It's the huge number of occurrences that makes the task insurmountable in the time frame.
They expect 2 to 7% failure rate on microprocessors. Now, that's not very high percentage-wise when you think about it, but just in the last 2 years, we've shipped about 10 billion microprocessors. So when you start looking at a 2 to 7% failure rate, and they don't know which ones these are, then 2 to 7% of 10 billion
is between 200 and 700 million. The computers in the offices aren't the only problem.
But the problems will be spread out. The embedded system problem, which is the hardest, depends on how the chip inside a
a process controller, say a valve in a plant. Those chips may or may not know what the correct time is.
There are so many of these embedded chips in so many places.
A single offshore oil platform has about 10,000 microprocessors, embedded systems.
All this adds up to potential failures in just about every industry.
Everything that you can imagine has, in some way, shape, or form, a dependency or an interconnection to some kind of computerized system. Whether it's the electricity, whether it's water, whether it's our telecommunications, the banking industry, our cars, anything that that uses computer technology or talks to computer technology can have a problem.
These failures could be as simple as a delay in routing a phone call or as serious as a major power blackout. Senator Robert Bennett, chairman of the Senate Y2K committee, puts it this way. The size and scope of the Y2K crisis is still unknown. What is known is that it has the potential to be a major national disaster. We can hope for the best, but we must not rule out preparation for the worst.
The worst case scenario, which may be very low probability, is very bad. I mean, you could have total breakdowns.
A multi-system failure where you have power, water, telecommunications, kinds of disruptions, or the potential for those disruptions, are typically caused by natural disasters. So there is a physical destruction component, and it is geographically isolated. This is a global problem. There is no geographic isolation here.
The generally accepted definition of worst case scenario is we have complete failure of critical infrastructure, which means no power, no water, no telecommunications, breakdown in emergency services, breakdown in law and order, breakdown in the financial system. That's what we've heard as worst case scenario.
What would you do if your electricity went out for 3 days or 3 weeks? What if you went to the grocery store and it was closed because the delivery trucks weren't running? What if the ATMs quit working? Or you couldn't get gas for your car?
It's very rare to find anyone today who will say that nothing will happen.
The information is everywhere. Newspaper and magazine coverage is growing. There are books and videos for in-depth explanations. And the internet is the best source for all the latest developments.
This is a very survivable crisis. It's not the end of life as we know it. It's a huge headache. It's going to make us think a lot differently about our reliance on technology.
A lot of what we do in preparedness for Y2K is very similar to preparing for a natural disaster.
My advice to people is prepare the same way you would for a good blizzard.
A 3-day blizzard or the Canada-New England ice storms of early '98? Nobody knows.
Since there are so many unknowns, the quickest and easiest way to do preparedness is from worst case. I mean, if worst case scenario happens, there's nobody that's going to be able to, take care of everybody. So we really don't have any choice but to have to fall back under our own resources and our own contingency planning.
Preparedness can be thought of as insurance.
It's true life insurance. It's not even as expensive as the other forms of insurance. You could store a whole bunch of food and water and never need it, and that's great. It's like driving to work and not having a wreck. You didn't use your auto insurance that day. That's good. That's not bad.
If you don't need it, fine. But if it should come to pass, then you're ready for it.
So consider the worst case, collect your resources, and develop contingency plans. Study the map and plot your course to preparedness. Remember, with Crossroads ahead, proceed with caution. Preparing your home and family for the vast array of outcomes of unknown severity requires a lot of decisions. Decisions which depend on your lifestyle, your family, and your point of view.
You must do your own research. Do not rely on any one source. You really have to dig. You cannot take any answer you get at face value. You have to ask more questions.
And remember, through time, the landscape will change. As we get closer to 2000, new information will refine our assessment of the situation. Some systems will be tested as we pass through certain critical dates, like fiscal year changeovers.
There are 99-day problems that will happen the beginning, middle, and end of the year. There are problems that will happen in the year 2000. The last day of year 2000 is a problem date.
In our journey, the sources of information are professionals working or researching the year 2000 issues. These people are now speaking at conferences, testifying before Congress, and disseminating information about individual and community preparedness. The first step in the process is assessment.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about assessment. The first assessment that you have to do is basically looking at your own home, your own physical environment. Make a list of all of those things in your home. Now, I want you to prioritize those. which, if they failed, would have the most impact on your family?
Good question. In this program, we can't hope to give answers for everyone. Our goal is to offer information. Information that will help you formulate your own preparedness strategy.
Information has never scared people. Lack of information has scared people.
The infrastructure is built on electricity. If the power system has problems, it will affect every service it supports. There are 4 regional power grids in the United States, all interconnected by computers, and all networked together by the telephone system.
Natural gas and oil and gas, of course, generate electricity. And they're also used directly in our homes. So we also need to think about the fact that these might not be available. There was an article out from World Oil. It's an industry publication put out by the petroleum industry. In it, they expressed extreme concern about the year 2000 problem, specifically with embedded systems, not all of which are accessible. They're underwater, or they're encased in steel or concrete. I mean, you literally have to dismantle things to get to them. That's even if you know where they are.
Those of us that have talked to power companies are hearing fairly good news from them. They acknowledge that they have a lot to do, but they claim to have it under control. That needs to be evaluated. There's obviously a huge potential for problems. What is the probability of the problems is the question now. And you know, if it's very likely there will be power outages, will they be sporadic? Will the whole grid go down? Will it be a day, 2 days, a week? The contingency plans, personal or governmental, are much different. If it's a 90% probability that it won't be more than a day, we could deal with that. If there's 90% probability that it'll be at least a week, it's a whole different story.
A lot of people have homes that are almost entirely electric. Their heat is electric, all the lighting, everything that they have in there is electric. So you need to look at your physical environment and you have to figure out, make a list of all the things in your home that run on electricity. Your heat, your range and oven, is it electric? You have refrigerators.
Washers, dryers, cordless phones, kitchen appliances, TVs, VCRs, stereos, clocks, computers, and home office equipment. There might be in-home medical equipment, a security system, a humidifier, a sump pump. Every home is different.
Now, just because you have natural gas doesn't mean that you still don't rely on electricity.
What people don't realize is that if their electricity goes out, their gas furnace doesn't work because the fan won't tumble.
One of the things we have to do is lower our expectations. We cannot try to heat our entire house. We have to try to heat an area. If we reduce our expectations and reduce what we're trying to do, then we will use less resources.
Unfortunately, a lot of people think it's not going to be a problem, or they believe that they haven't been convinced it's going to be a problem yet.
It's going to be the middle of winter. We're going to get cold.
What is the average temperature in January where you live? How much does it drop at night?
If we lose power, that means we can lose lights. We need lights for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is psychology, the psychological aspects of having light. Light is very important to our well-being, especially in a crisis, especially if you have children. Children get very afraid of the dark.
Where does the power service enter your home? Is your service on fuses or breakers? Do you have spare fuses? Are circuits in your breaker box labeled? To quote Senator Bennett, there is a virtual certainty of power brownouts and blackouts in some areas. The possibility of power rationing exists both regionally and locally.
What do you do if you have brownouts or power shortages are sporadic? For example, an air conditioner or a refrigerator compressor, especially the little bit older ones, if you keep turning them on and off, as would happen if the power was going on and off, pretty soon you can destroy the compressor.
And I personally think that the scenario for dirty power, unstable power, insufficient power, and brownouts is a higher probability than outages. And I don't know what's worse. If you have a clean outage, your equipment turns off, but when you get the electricity back, your equipment works again. But if you have extremely dirty power and insufficient power, you can burn out motors that don't have a Y2K problem, but they end up having their motors burned out. And then when the electricity gets clean again, you can't operate the equipment. So I don't know what's worse, outages or brownouts. It will be interesting to find out.
In terms of electricity, you can buy a backup generator The problem is now you've got to store gasoline, or if you want to spend a lot of money, you've got to store diesel. And again, the diesel generator is more expensive than a gas generator. You might spend $500 on a gas generator and find out that you really don't want to store lots of gas. And these things suck gas very rapidly. So a few gallons wouldn't take you but more than a few hours.
It's tricky, very difficult to store. If you don't have a generator, you don't have the fuel storage and maintenance problems.
What I have gone to, though, is the acceptance that we wouldn't have electricity for very long. If it goes off, I'm not going to worry about a generator. It would only provide temporary electricity. So we have backup heat, and heat is, again, the major problem.
Of course, nothing works as well to keep you warm as a nice big fat dog, but other than that, it's probably a good idea to either have a wood stove, kerosene space heater, or some other way that you can maintain the house.
A generator maybe for a very short term, a kerosene stove or a few, and then maybe even for a longer term outage a wood burning stove that you could even cook on.
Setting up and testing any alternative heat source will assure it's working when you need it.
If your house is very well insulated, that would help a great deal. Other than that, we can just use some basic common sense and shut doors on rooms that we're not going to be using, like the bedrooms, close off areas of the house that we just don't use very often. Try not to go in and out exterior doors as often. Perhaps use exterior doors in another section of the house that isn't being heated. There's a lot of ways that we can conserve heat, and we know how to do that now.
Consider insulating windows with plastic, using blankets between heated and unheated rooms. Consider insulating yourself with heavier clothing.
So I think part of our preparedness materials is going to be stocking up on the right clothes and shoes and coats and hats and gloves.
Most new homes have gas logs. Gas logs are great. They will burn even when the electricity is off, typically, but they don't provide a lot of space heat.
I like kerosene space heaters for a couple of reasons. One is they're built so that if they're knocked or tipped, they immediately shut off. So they're less likely a fire hazard. A good one can burn about 1,000 BTU, can heat an area about 1,000 square feet, and can heat for about 12 hours on one tank.
I like kerosene because it's not very volatile. It can be used with relative safety inside as long as you've got windows cracked.
If we're using alternative light sources and heat sources, then of course we introduce some safety issues that we don't normally have to worry about. If we have a wood stove, we have to make sure that it's maintained properly so that we don't get a backdraft and basically smoke us out of the house.
If you just set a wood stove up in your basement, for example, and you don't vent it properly with the right rise and run, then you could end up with smoke, you could end up with a fire, all kinds of issues. So you have to prepare ahead of time.
If we're using a kerosene heater, we have to make sure that we don't spill the fuel or otherwise cause a fire. And same thing with kerosene lanterns. We're going to have to be very careful. And this is especially true with children. We're going to need to teach them how to be careful around some of these objects. We don't want people getting burned. We don't want houses being burnt up or burnt down because of accidents that didn't need to happen. There are some fuels like diesel, kerosene, propane that are safer to store for a longer period of time. You do not want to store fuels in the house. You want to store them outside or perhaps in the garage, and you may not want to store them all in one place together. It would be a really good idea, if you haven't done it in a long time, to practice your safety drills, your fire safety drills. Make sure that you have fire extinguishers in the home and that everyone knows where and how to handle fuels that you're using. Also, if you have to be working around anything that does give off any kind of fumes, it's probably best to use a flashlight or a light stick so that way you don't accidentally cause sparks. And make sure you stress that with children too, that they should not be playing around any of the areas where you are going to be storing fuel. There's a lot of alternatives to lights, of course. That we can have kerosene lamps, we can have candles, we can have battery operated lights, we can have flashlights.
For about $8 you can buy a nice little hurricane lamp, and a small lantern this size, easily lit, will burn a long time on a small amount of kerosene or lamp oil and light a pretty good sized room.
There are solar alternatives to light. Fairly inexpensive collectors can be used to charge batteries. Passive solar is used to heat both homes and water tanks.
The problem with solar is that it's hard to directly power an appliance, for example, with solar. You need a battery storage system so that the solar can charge a battery. Then you have a stable reservoir of energy. Then you use that energy to run an appliance. Is it 6 volt? Is it 12 volt? And you've got to work all these things out in advance to know what backup power you have for the kinds of appliances that you're going to want to operate.
Consider practicing without electricity over a weekend. Many water systems depend on computers and the power network, so any failures may affect the quality and availability of water supplies.
Water's a big problem. We may be without water from the city, from municipal sources for a short or long period of time. You need to make sure that you have drinkable water. It's possible, 2 things. 1, there may be an interruption in water supply, or 2, there may be a possibility that the water's contaminated. So even if it did flow, you wouldn't want to use it. You're going to go through your home, you're going to find out, okay, well, what have I got for water? Am I using city water? Do I have well water? You know, what am I doing for water? If you have well water, you need to find out whether that well pump is electric. And if it is, you need to figure out how you're going to get water out of the well if there's no electricity. So again, you might want to pump it out ahead of time, put it in some drums, and then store it.
Water is the most difficult thing to have enough of. It is something you need lots of, and it's hard to store.
Okay, how much?
A gallon per person per day.
2 quarts for drinking, 2 quarts for food preparation and sanitation.
And a quart a day per person for pretty much emergency drinking.
Children, nursing mothers, and ill people may need more than 2 quarts of water per day. Don't forget that pets will need water too.
3 days is an absolute minimum because that is what it usually requires emergency services to reach you in a severe kind of regional disaster. Obviously, it could be more prolonged than that. I feel more comfortable with 6 months supply.
I mean, if you just do the numbers, a family of 4, just serving 90 days worth of water, we're looking at 360 gallons. That's a lot of water. A lot of water.
Right here, I think there are about 60 of these, so that's 300 gallons.
Even if it's still coming through the tap, it may not be clean because the actual purification process itself is computerized. If we have a breakdown in sanitation, in good drinkable water supply, that what we will see is an increase in typhoid, dysentery, and cholera. These are third world diseases. We don't normally see them here. But if we don't have an adequate and clean water supply, we could see a rise. So it's extremely important that you make sure that your water supply is clean.
You might discuss with your doctor getting vaccinations against these diseases in advance.
Basically, I would assume any water that is not coming out of a tap and that you did not control the storage of is contaminated. It could have particulate contamination from a chemical, or it could have something living in it. We've tried to cover that with water storage that we know is clean, and then 2 to 3 different ways of decontaminating impure water, using maybe a combination of boiling, of adding chemicals to kill organisms, and then filtering to purify for chemical agents. It's not necessarily so that any one given system, with the possible exception of the ceramic drip filter, will take care of all of those.
A water testing kit will allow you to check for contaminants in your water. There are 3 methods of purifying water: boiling, disinfecting, and distillation. Boiling water will neutralize any organic contamination. Bring water to a rolling boil and boil for 10 minutes. Keep in mind that some water will evaporate. Let the water cool before drinking or storing. Boiled water will taste better if you put oxygen back into it by pouring it back and forth between containers. This will also improve the taste of stored water.
The water that we store comes right out of the tap.
Before storing your water, treat it with a preservative, such as chlorine bleach, to prevent the growth of microorganisms. Use liquid bleach that contains 5.25% sodium hypochlorite and no soap. Some containers warn, "Not for personal use." You can disregard these warnings if the label states sodium hypochlorite is the only active ingredient, and if you use only the small quantities in these instructions. Add 4 drops of bleach per quart of water, or 2 scant teaspoons per 10 gallons, and stir. Seal your water in clear containers tightly. Label them with the date and store them in a cool, dark place. Rotate stored water every 6 months.
You can tell usually what happens if you've made a mistake or there's something in there, a growing medium, and you got some kind of an algae or what have you in there, they turn green. This isn't the ideal way to store it. For one thing, it's really not that good to have light being able to get to here, because if you do have something growing in there, I think it grows better with light.
So if we're going to be talking about water storage, then again it comes back to how long do you think you're going to have to store it for? How much can you store?
Storing 55 gallons in water weighs, what, 9-10 pounds a gallon. You have to be careful where you store that. And basements are good places to store water. They're concrete floor, weight's not an issue. The problem with the 55-gallon drums is that they're easier to neglect, because if you don't have a siphon filter or a pump, if you don't want to siphon them or have a pump, which I have bought, they're really inexpensive, a little pump that you just squeeze and it forces the water out. But if you don't have that, you'll tend to neglect it, and you may not rotate it, you may not dump it out.
And one of the things the community should be looking at is building additional water storage facilities for the community at large, because not everybody is going to be able to put 55-gallon drums in their houses.
I have 3 different kinds of filters. One is a straw that you can basically drink out of a stream, and one person would be able to use those maybe to filter 200 gallons or so. And the other filters are paper filters that I don't trust quite as much, but I might use those in a I do use those in a 72-hour pack, so that you could, let's say, filter out Giardia out of a stream. We have a drip system that's made of ceramic filters that works very well. This is about a $200 item, and inside here are ceramic filters, very, very small pores that will basically take anything out down to very small, 1 micron, 2 microns. And you basically just dump water in the top, set this on a counter or something, and the water siphons out of the top through the filters. It's a drip system, so you're not forcing small particles through a filter that will end up getting to you anyway. You can buy drip filters that will filter up to 10,000 gallons at a rate of 5 to 10 gallons a day. But I think the key is multiple systems that are pretty flexible that you can use under the right circumstances.
Be sure to stock extra filters for any system you use. Items you may want to consider purchasing can be found at hardware, surplus, or sporting goods stores. Resources can also be found on the internet.
When you're in an emergency situation, I don't believe you're going to want to use some water to clean with, or dishes or anything, and then toss it. You would have different levels of cleanliness. You would probably create a hierarchy of needs versus the cleanliness of the water. Your drinking water would be, of course, the purest. I have some large bags that I would try to use to store rainwater in. You certainly wouldn't want to use water that had dripped off your roof, or not necessarily if you have shingled roofs or what have you, for anything but cleaning. So you have to be careful where the water is landing, the rain is landing, and then how it's funneled into a container. As soon as you fear that there might be a contamination of water, consider turning off the inlet into your water heater so that it doesn't fill with contaminated water, and then you have that.
Caution: if you use your hot water tank for water storage, be sure to disable the heating element, so that when the water is drained, you aren't heating an empty tank.
Water in the back of your toilet can also be used, not the pot, but in the toilet for at least hand washing or certain kinds of things like that. I don't think I would drink it, but definitely melting snow. You don't want to eat the snow, it'll freeze you up pretty quickly. It's a bad idea.
Hot water tanks, washing machines, even bathtubs can be used as temporary reservoirs for water.
Water coming into your home and water leaving your home in terms of sewage are actually 2 different systems, which means if you flush your toilet, it may not clear your house. To continue to use your toilet, and then just make sure you use rainwater, snow water, or some other kind of gray water, not drinking water, to use to flush your system. If there's any problem with the sewage systems, in case that it backs up or something, you're going to need to have either a chemical toilet, similar to this one, a composting toilet, or simply have to dig a hole in your backyard and perhaps use a little bit of an outhouse situation. Here's one of the things that we're going to be using for sanitation. All it is just a 5-gallon plastic container with a plastic toilet seat lid.
We will put a a plastic bag, a large trash bag, double lined, so 2 of them, and that would be used as a toilet facility. And after it is used, you would simply take some bleach and sprinkle it, recover it so that it stays isolated, and then every time someone uses it, you would simply a little bit of bleach, and then before it gets difficult to handle, you would simply tie it, seal it, and bury it at least 2 feet, preferably maybe in something like a buried trash can. That's not necessarily a good long-term disposal idea, but it would keep it from transferring to groundwater or being dug up or what have you. When things return to normal, you would have a place where you could go and dispose of that in the right way.
The other issue with sanitation is cleanliness. If you aren't able to keep yourself clean, then you are inviting disease. And it's important to keep your clothes clean. Being in a crisis situation does not mean you can let yourself go. If anything, it's even more important that you do everything you can to protect your health.
If everyone were to say today, okay, I think it's necessary to go out and buy a generator and buy a bunch of freeze-dried food or beans or whatever, the supply chain isn't there to deal with that.
It's likely that the retail industry is going to experience some delays in shipments. They have become so automated, so just in time, because nobody maintains inventory, stock, for any length of time anymore. Most supermarkets only have about a 72-hour supply of food, which means that if there is any breakdown in delivery schedules or in trucking or shipping of any sort, then that means that some of the supermarkets may run low. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily a food shortage, it just may mean that it not get to your supermarket in a timely fashion. We need to learn how to shop for the long term. We need to learn how to shop for maybe a week or 2 at a time, as opposed to just a day at a time, or a couple days at a time, or the weekend.
Instead of 1 can of green beans, buy 3 for a while.
And you don't need to buy everything all at once. You should buy a little bit at a time. There's a couple reasons for that. One is it lets you spread out the cost of stocking up on preparedness supplies. It also gives the retail industry time to begin to ramp up to meet demand, because as we get closer to the year 2000, the demand will increase for more goods, and we want to give them time to be able to react to that.
All it requires is buying what you normally buy and buying a little bit more of it for a while until you build the stock, and then you're just back to buying the same amount you would ever buy.
We're buying enough for us as well as a few neighbors. So if we look at our modern kitchens today, let's see what kind of things we might need to deal with if we should have a loss of critical infrastructure. If there's a loss of power, that means that the supermarkets are not going to be able to maintain their refrigerated and frozen sections. So the only type foods they'll have available would be dry goods or canned foods. So what you need to do is eat your perishable goods out of your refrigerator first, and then eat the perishable goods out of your freezer. And this is before you would start into your preparedness supplies. Now, what you can do if you live in a cold climate, which is a bit of a benefit, is you can get yourself a styrofoam cooler with the lid, and you can put things like milk and cheese and eggs in that and put it outside on your front stoop, as long as the temperature doesn't really go over 40 degrees. When we stock up on supplies for our families, we really need to take a look at what we currently have.
I've come up with a basic idea that there are three ways of storing food and using it, and there's a lot of overlap. What I might call the A storage plan is sort of a more traditional bulk grain storage, where you're storing items that are A, very cheap, B, that store for a long time. Those are the nice things about it. But C, require a little bit more extensive preparation. The B plan would be dehydrated foods. Long-term storage. I mean, you can go 15 years on most dehydrated, good quality foods. Somewhat expensive, but the advantage here is that they don't take up a lot of space. You buy them, you store them, and to eat, you basically heat water.
Prepackaged selections are sometimes called MREs, meals ready to eat.
In the middle is the expanded pantry, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily halfway between the two, but it's just a good way to start. And the concept there is to just store the things that you eat on a regular basis, and when you go shopping, instead of taking your shopping bags to the kitchen, and dumping them into your pantry, you create a store of items in another location, and then the shopping bags go to that location, the expanded pantry, and then you're basically shopping from your expanded pantry when you want to refill your kitchen pantry. So it creates a buffer, a large store of items that you use on a constant basis. I think we have about 300 or so cans here. Again, you set up the shelves and the number of shelves per product depending on what your family wants.
When you do a long-term food storage program, you want to eat out of your food storage so that way you can constantly replenish it with goods that are going to be expiring at later dates.
A few keys about expanded storage. Don't store anything that will perish once it's opened. If it can't be eaten all at one time, if it will perish, don't store it in your expanded pantry.
Now, one of the things that you want to keep in mind when you stock up on your supplies is to make sure that you have a very balanced diet. You don't want to stock up on junk food. You want to make sure that you have your vegetables, that you have soups, that you have things that nutritious items that'll carry you through any kind of a crisis. The other thing that you need to know about canned goods is you need to check the expiration date. Now, this one happens to expire in May of 1999. If you do stock up on canned goods, make sure that you're able to use them by the expiration date. Some canned goods do not have expiration dates on them. Instead, they have some kind of a code that needs to be deciphered. Oftentimes, shopkeepers don't know what those codes mean. You actually would need to contact the manufacturer to find out what the expiration date is.
Meat you'll put a high value on. It's got a lot of protein in it. Again, we use this, so we only buy down here what we use on a regular basis. Spices store well, bouillon cubes.
It is comforting to have things like cocoa mix in an emergency. It's always a good bet to go with dried goods.
These are nice, very easy to prepare, pretty much dehydrated food. You add water and hot water, and you basically have any of these potatoes or prepared rice.
Now, the benefit of canned goods is this water issue. If you buy canned goods, it has its own water. I mean, we tend to get in the habit of pouring it off, but we can use it to cook it, or cook it with, let's say, things like rice.
I don't store a lot of dehydrated because it's expensive, and I have chosen to go the other route. But you can see here margarine powder, peanut butter. TVP is basically textured vegetable protein. That's soy protein. I test this stuff all the time. I don't want to be storing something that I can't use. This is basically what it looks like. Not terribly attractive, but I actually mixed some of that up in water with the right amount of water and fried it. Smell it? Yeah. And I fried it, and it tasted like eggs. It didn't look like eggs. It looked like a vinyl seat cover, but it was actually pretty good. But you would bake with this, and you would use this anywhere you would use eggs as a thickening agent. I would suggest people living alone or elderly and/or would have meals that they can quickly open, maybe heat with sterno, but not require a lot of preparation. That uses a lot of energy, and you're doing a lot of preparation for one meal, and who knows if the rest of it's going to go to waste. So dehydrated foods are very good that way.
Okay, now one of the things that we can consider is pre-preparedness. This is an electric dehydrator, but I look at it this way. While I have electricity, I'm going to make use of it. If you grow tomatoes and vegetables like we do, this is a good device to use before year 2000 to go ahead and dehydrate the things that you've grown in your garden. I've dried these about 1.5 years ago, and you can see I just put them in a mason jar. And you should always, of course, put the date on top of when you have dried foods. We have an electric stove right now. We're going to replace that with a gas stove, natural gas stove, that we can adapt to propane. But I'd like to caution people that do not use this kind of a device, a gas range, to heat your home. That can be very dangerous. You can run into carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide poisoning.
We have a kerosene stove that has a cooktop on it. We have propane. You could use your charbroiler, but propane doesn't last that long. So for indoors, a kerosene stove. In addition to that, we have a sterno that we can use to boil water with the little sterno stand. To my right is a wood stove. The wood stove has a cooktop on it, a griddle. The wood stove is not mobile. I mean, you wouldn't want to take it apart and move it somewhere else. So again, that would be used if we saw an extended period of time where we were having to prepare food. 2 months, you do things differently than you would for a 6-month period. Or for a 2-day period, your behavior and your preparation, or what you use, is different than if you're looking at a 6-month period. So you got to be flexible with your cooking sources. One last note about cooking. Be very careful. Certain fuels will actually poison you. They create carbon monoxide in great quantities. Gasoline, white Coleman fuel, kerosene, and propane create, my understanding, is less carbon monoxide, but they do use up the room oxygen, so you have to crack a window. Other items you might consider: a good skillet, good pots that are very heavy duty that could hold up under a greater, let's say, a flame as opposed to just an electric range.
And let's say you do have a wood stove, you might want to turn to something like this to be able to cook, especially if you don't have an oven. This is a Dutch oven. It's made for heavy duty use. You can put it on top of your wood stove, you can even put it in a fireplace, you can put it in a fire pit, you can put it in a barbecue outside, and you can bake bread, you can make stews, you can cook meat, you can do just about anything in here. And you can pick up any one of these at either a hardware store or flea markets. They're actually the best place.
There are some people that I know who have gone a month on their food storage. The comments I received back from them were, you need several good can openers because one will break and then you're finished. I have lots of disposable items, single-serving plastic dishes that I have bought because, again, you don't want to waste a lot of water cleaning things out.
A lot of people ask, well, you know, what about my pets? What am I going to do to feed my pets? And we're going to have to prepare for them like we do for ourselves. We have to make sure that we stock up on food, that we keep it in sealed containers so that we don't have to worry about rodents or bugs or something getting into it.
Some people consider their pets to be food storage, but we don't.
Anytime we have a crisis, we usually have an increase in healthcare need. Unfortunately, the healthcare industry has not been as proactive in dealing with year 2000 problems as some of the other industries.
At this point in time, most physicians don't really have a good understanding of year 2000 issues and what the ramifications may be. So you have to be a little bit skeptical of any year 2000 advice you get from the medical community unless you latch onto the right person.
States are responsible for such things as hospitals. I think it's important that states themselves become involved in helping hospitals stock up on needed medications and also help to cover the costs, making a pool of money available to hospitals or care facilities.
I've talked with hospitals that are avoiding building new buildings or avoiding buying new equipment because they're dealing with year 2000 issues. That's the attitude that has to be taken. Now, if the insurance company hasn't year 2000 problems, there can be a disruption in cash flow to the hospitals, and the hospitals are operating fairly lean and they don't have a lot of reserves to ride out a significant disruption in payment. And especially if the disruption comes in Medicare or Medicaid, hospitals rely very heavily on that income, and if there's problems in those payment systems, that could be very traumatic for hospitals.
So we need to have some understandings in place with them that they will continue to provide goods and services in spite of the fact that maybe they're not going to get paid right away. It's very important that the community be talking to these doctors and hospitals and emergency facilities to make sure that they are taking care of all aspects of healthcare, not just their accounting and billing systems, that they are taking care of their embedded systems issues with regards to the building systems.
The big challenges, I think, are in the contingency planning and emergency preparedness.
Many hospitals are not set up for long-term power shortages. And the generators themselves, there's been reports that some of the generators have year 2000 problems. Defibrillators, radiological equipment, hospital refrigeration systems, hospital communications. What would happen if you have an emergency room on the bottom floor and you need to get a patient up to the third floor surgery and the elevators are not working?
What happens if my child gets hurt and the hospital is closed or is operating on emergency only basis and I can't get the things that I need because it's not enough of an emergency? How do I deal with that?
We cannot allow things to happen simply because it wasn't somebody's job to take care of that. They all need to be working together with each other, and they need to understand that they are dependent on each other. And if one part of it works and the other part of it doesn't, none of it works.
I'm not as concerned about the major metropolitan medical centers as I am concerned about the small, the rural, the medium-sized ones, and the inner-city hospitals that may not have the funding to really deal with the year 2000 problem now.
Are you dependent on medical devices? If you are, you need to be talking to your doctor. Do not let them put you off. Do not let them say to you, this is nothing.
I think there will be problems. There will be some things that just don't get done that need to get done, and some people hurt in the process.
A good example is blood banks. If we have some severe problems and the blood bank itself loses power, it has no backup or sufficient backup systems, it would be very difficult to continue to store backup blood supplies, which means we may have a shortage in blood. This is not to frighten people. This is just to say that these are issues that need to be taken care of.
I've dealt with some insurance companies that plain do not want to talk to the healthcare providers. They don't want to talk to the hospitals or the clinics about what they're doing to get ready for year 2000 because they assume that they may be taking on some of that risk from the healthcare provider by acknowledging that they have a problem.
We cannot be complacent about this. We need to pressure and encourage our healthcare facilities and healthcare workers to make sure that they do pay attention to every aspect of the industry, whether or not it falls into their jurisdiction.
Hospitals, like almost every other organization that deals with materials, they've gone to just-in-time kind of approaches. So they tend to have a very minimal inventory on hand, and they rely on their suppliers to be able to deliver on some kind of regular basis or some kind of emergency basis when needed. A lot of hospitals are preparing for year 2000, laying in extra inventory, extra supplies of medications, of all kinds of things, diesel fuel for their generators, but quite honestly, they don't have the storage facilities and they don't have the money to tie up an inventory for a lot of stockpiling of materials. If a hospital has significant year 2000 problems and a lot of things have to go back to manual methods, there may be a lot of places where people, even untrained people, could be very helpful in keeping that hospital operating.
You could be a major resource for your community. Just what you know isn't known by everybody. Ambulance services are separate entities from hospitals. And the conversations I've had with a local blood bank here have resulted in nothing. They are separate businesses. The hospitals don't feel it's their responsibility. It's not, they're running into this jurisdictional thing. They don't think it's their responsibility to make sure that these people can deliver.
I think hospitals, like all organizations, respond to their customers. And if the customers start asking hard questions of the hospitals or the clinics or the other healthcare facilities, I think they'll need to respond, or they'll feel compelled to respond. I think people need to start asking the questions.
Do you have family members, or do you yourself have medical problems? Many of us have medical problems. We are either dependent on devices, or we're dependent on medication, or we have some kind of disability that requires some kind of care. Assess your own physical needs. Assess your own physical vulnerabilities and risks. Have discussions with the hospitals, with your doctors, and don't take everything's going to be fine. Just say, look, prove it to me, or tell me what you're going to do instead. Give me contingency plans if you're wrong.
Consider having medical and dental exams before the year 2000 to identify problems.
One of the biggest issues that's come up is the idea of prescription medications. We could have a problem not only getting prescription medications to us, but storing them. So you need to talk to your doctors, and you need to find out what they can do to make sure that either they or that your local hospitals are going to stock up on needed medication. It's very difficult to stockpile medication because most of us are not allowed to have more than a month's supply on hand. Not all medication stores well for extended period of times, or it requires certain conditions like refrigeration to be stored.
Medicine does have a fairly short shelf life in some cases, and so rotating it, keeping it away from the children, and making sure that you're very conscious of how you're using it.
Then there's the cost. Not everybody's going to be able to afford to stockpile medication, even if they can store it well.
We have a complete storage of over-the-counter medication. Sunblock, lots of cold medicine, things that would increase your comfort, toothpaste, you know, if you have kids that get dry skin, things that you can use there. Nose spray, to allergy medications, to pain relievers, to, for example, anti-diarrheal medicines.
Talk to your doctor and dentist about any supplies you may require.
because we may not have access to emergency services as quickly as we're used to having it now. We're going to have to learn to be a little more self-reliant in a crisis situation than perhaps we need to be right now. You need to have a really good home emergency kit. And don't forget, even though this is individual preparedness, this is also for your neighbors. So make sure you have enough on hand, not only for yourself, but for the person next door.
We have basic first aid kits. We have several of those that are sort of specific to members of the family and needs that we might have based on age or allergies or what have you.
One of the other things that you can do is take first aid courses. Take at least a basic first aid course, and that includes children. Everybody should know CPR. I'm just curious, how many people have had CPR training? Wow. Keep in mind that there's a lot of reference materials available, most of which are available at your local library. These are two of my favorites. If you take a first aid course, which we strongly recommend every family take, you'll get this Responding to Emergencies, which is one of the best books I've seen on handling first aid emergencies. My other favorite book and training material is, of course, FEMA's online emergency preparedness courses. These are free courses. You can take them online, or you can actually order the books and take this course from home. But this is an excellent resource for learning how to develop your own contingency plans and developing your own personal preparedness plans. Then the next thing we're going to go to is telecommunications. It can be your computers, it can be pagers, it can be cell phones, it can be TV, it could be radio, it could be a lot of things. Go ahead and look at what your telecommunications are in your home. If electricity goes down or the phones go down, that means it may affect radio, television, that kind of things, your normal information sources. Some of the consequences of having, let's say, television or radio going out is, of course, it means that it's very difficult to get information. And people need information in a crisis situation just to avoid a panic. It's important that any kind of public communication, such as TV or radio, has sufficient backup power or generation systems to be able to sustain it through probably a several-week period.
The possibility is you pick an AM radio station, make sure it has a generator and a power supply, and make that using the old Civil Defense Network. If you remember, you'd hear that tone on the radio and then he'd tell you that a storm was coming or whatever. They could use that same system that's already in place, make sure that they're going to have sustainable power, and use that to communicate.
One of the issues is that very quickly in a major disaster, what happens is the phones go out. And in addition, cell phones are pretty useless.
Now, phone, of course, is our link to the outside world. For your own sake, you should figure out how can you reach your doctor? How can you reach the hospital? How can you reach any emergency services? If you have anyone in your family that has medical problems and at any time might need to contact emergency services, you need to figure out how to make that happen if the lines go down. Do you have personal medical devices? We have family members that if they have a heart attack or something, they have a device that they can click and it's electric and it sends a signal to wiring in the house, which sends a signal out to an emergency service.
Consult your doctor for alternative medical devices and for methods of contacting necessary emergency services. Research the appropriate first aid or response techniques that apply to your medical concerns.
One of the things neighborhoods and communities should be looking at is having alternative forms of communication, such as walkie-talkies or handheld CBs, which can have a range of 4 to 5 miles depending on the type of unit that you buy.
We already had in place ham radio operators that helped us in emergencies, and if we were devastated by a tornado, in the past it was the nuclear strike or whatever, we had plans in place where ham radio operators who, as long as they have fuel in the tank of their car, can drive around and talk on their radios to each other and relay that to our emergency operations center.
The easiest way to visualize how neighborhoods can be communicating with each other is, let's say you have neighborhood A over here and neighborhood B, neighborhood C, and if you had one person from each neighborhood that was designated to be the person who communicates with the other neighborhood, then that will greatly facilitate the flow of information and communication.
The reason ham radio works and has worked in emergencies is that, number one, you can network lots of people on the same frequency so they can hear and communicate nearly simultaneously. In addition to that, it does not depend on the infrastructure, the telephone lines and such. It is line of sight, so it's not required to have a satellite or bouncing a signal. They're fairly powerful. They can reach quite a ways. And for that reason, they have been the best source of communications in most emergencies where the infrastructure is down. We can get 10 or 12, 15 miles out of it, even 20 in some cases, but it'll definitely cover a town or a geographic area of 10 square miles, something like that, without any trouble. My total equipment costs to be completely mobile with a backup battery and charger, $300-400.
There's a lot of ham radio operators out there. There's single sideband. There is a lot of other forms of communication that could be available to us. The other thing that's probably very important to have is making sure that the emergency services, fire, police, hospital, that they all have alternative forms of communication such as CB, and that the neighborhoods and these services know what channels they're on and how they can reach them in an emergency. The only way to ensure that that will happen is if we do contingency planning beforehand and make sure that the emergency services have the same type of communication systems that are available to the neighborhoods.
Well, we just finished a communications drill for this area, and it's good to do that because you find out where your weaknesses are, you find out what works well, what doesn't, also what geographical areas maybe aren't covered well because they're down in a valley or something.
If you have alternate communications, think of it as a backup to existing communication systems, whereas if they go down, you still have a way to communicate with the outside world.
FEMA and others have advised people for dozens of years, you should have an AM radio and a fresh set of batteries in your house.
Both handhelds and the base station can run off of batteries, which can be rechargeable by solar. People need to find out how long their batteries are going to last in general, just so they know they can decide for themselves how many batteries they want to have. Try to at least have enough battery power on hand to run a unit continuously for 1 week.
I have a solar panel that's large enough to power a battery that will run my ham radio. It will run my computer if I needed to. It wouldn't run a major appliance.
We know of somebody who's got a bicycle hooked up to a battery charger, and he's be able to recharge batteries that way. I think that we could probably get very creative in coming up with finding alternative sources of energy for necessary electronic devices such as these.
This is a hand crank shortwave AM/FM radio that requires no external power source.
We are going to have more than one type of communication device just to make sure we have all our bases covered.
I have heard people talk about using pigeons, but I'm not sure that's too workable either.
There are these small family channel walkie-talkies. They may have 1 or 2 channels, just a few channels. Very restricted, but what they're good for is if you have kids and they're out running around in the yard, or maybe they're running down to the neighbor's house or something like that, the family unit itself can keep in touch with each other.
If you can ask people in your group, whatever group that may be, to create a color coding system whereby, for example, you were riding by in your car and you saw a piece of red construction paper up in a window, that would mean they need help immediately. If it's yellow, it might mean they're okay, but eventually we'll need some contact. Green would be go on to somebody else.
The Gartner Group states that between $3 and $6 trillion will be invested internationally to address Y2K issues. Global repercussions are projected.
I went to Washington recently and I met with the FDIC. They're making a lot of efforts to make sure there is enough actual hard currency on hand so that people can take significant amounts out of the bank for preparedness purposes without it causing problems for the banks. And that's really what it is. I think it's more the security thing. People just want to know they can get their money out of the bank. It's not so much they want to get it all out. From my perspective, in a neighborhood, it doesn't make any sense for me to pull my money out of the bank because I need that bank and my local businesses need that bank. And if everybody takes their money out, the bank is going to collapse, and that's only going to make it harder for us to get through this. Now, yes, we need to have some money on hand because we're going to need it if there are any financial problems. But taking it all out and sticking it in your mattress isn't the right answer. What you need to do is really good preparedness. Make sure you have enough stuff on hand so that you don't need to go to the bank.
Have some cash at home in case people aren't taking checks, in case the banks aren't taking deposits.
But we don't necessarily need to have paper or gold or silver to buy and sell the things that we need.
We should be able to barter for those kinds of services that we cannot provide for ourselves.
If there is any glitches in the computer systems, there may be problems with some of the legacy data. So if you have hard copies, it's much easier and quicker to resolve any problems if you don't have to depend on their records, which may be in error or may be inaccessible.
If there are any questions about your accounts, the burden of proof is on you.
Along with financial records, though, you should also keep hard copies of your medical and dental and educational records.
I have a file where we have gathered all of our important documents, home mortgages, wills, birth certificates, anything that's very important to you or critical identification or ownership type document. It's a good idea to photocopy those items and to keep them off-site.
Public transportation, buses, light rail, trains, and planes, may experience interruptions. The FAA is not projected to be compliant before the millennium. Insurance carriers may not cover airlines that are not 100% compliant. This could ground air traffic.
Some of the transportation that we're most concerned about is, of course, fire engines, ambulances, mostly emergency service vehicles. It might not be possible for us to go down to our gas station and get gas for our car. Getting to and from, let's say, emergency services might be difficult. It might be difficult for emergency services to get to us. For two reasons. One, because there may not be electricity to pump the gas. Also, the production of these materials themselves are at risk.
If petroleum supplies are limited or rationed, ride-sharing may be an alternative. Create ride-sharing networks in advance.
Some of the other aspects of transportation other than the actual vehicles themselves that we might need to be concerned about as a community is such thing as traffic signals. A lot of the traffic signaling equipment is, of course, microprocessor based. There again has been evidence that there could be some year 2000 failures. Also, if we have a loss in power, we may have a loss in some signaling systems. So it's going to be very important that citizens, if they are still able to get around, realize that they can't necessarily depend on traffic signals to tell them what's happening in a traffic sense. They need to stop. They need to pay attention to what's going on around them, especially at railroad crossings. The Long Island Railroad not too long ago discovered that it did have some problems with some of the crossing gates. Some of the microprocessors there had some problems. Let's err on the side of caution and just expect that these systems are not going to work correctly. And let's not just blindly go across bridges or railroad tracks or through intersections without taking the time to make sure that we understand what's happening around us. Security is not only, the tools, but it's also the mindset. You have to think secure, you have to act secure, and you have to work with other people to be secure. I get asked all the time, should I get a gun? And my answer is, the best security you have is a prepared neighbor. People who have a gun and don't know how to use it are as much a threat to themselves as they are to anyone else.
If you share with those around you, then you're safer. You have a community of people that are prepared, and you can specialize in your labor, and you can have a much better shot at getting by than people who are just holding up in their house, for example.
This can end up to be a hiccup, and we could still have panic, and it could lead to civil unrest and hoarding and the collapse of many of our systems just by human reaction. And to me, that's an equal risk to the risk of the year 2000.
If you are mentally prepared, you will be much calmer. Your children and your family and your neighbors can count on you, and that will help all of us get through this.
Physically inspect your home to be sure windows, doors, and garage doors have working locks. Consider replacing inexpensive locks with deadbolts.
in an emergency, in a crisis situation, one of the last things the police respond to is home security systems, because they're often knocked out and they often do false alarms. So they're way down on the priority list.
Let's say, what do you do when you have a fire? Should the children leave their rooms during a fire? If there is an emergency in our local area and we're all separated, or we started out separated, where do we meet? Who do we call? How do we know how to get back together?
Consider practicing without electricity, running water, the telephone, and your car for a weekend. You will quickly identify the strengths and weaknesses in your preparedness strategy.
Those who do best in crisis situations are those that are approaching it with a positive perspective and a positive attitude, believing that they're going to be okay, and having prepared and having a very clear idea of what they need to do in a variety of situations.
Even without the possibility of Y2K related disruptions, this preparedness information will apply to any emergency situation. We hope our map here helps you to get your bearings, to prepare as best you can for yourself and your family. If we work with our neighbors and organize our communities, we can take advantage of all our strengths. Approaching the Crossroads could actually be a very positive experience.
If you're ready to start building your personal Y2K preparedness plan, you can receive a free Year 2000 Crossroads Home Preparedness Workbook. Simply mail the coupon included with this video, along with $3.75 for shipping and handling. This handy pocket-sized planning guide will take you through all of the areas covered in the program: power, water, food, medical, and communications. Other important areas covered include transportation, health, safety, personal finance, and records. For every area, it gives you a detailed checklist along with some great tips. As you review the items in the checklist, mark off the items that you feel you need. Once you have prepared all the items checked, you can check off your done boxes, which helps you track your progress. The material in this guide was adapted from information from authoritative sources like FEMA and the National Red Cross. Both the guide and the video were produced in association with the Cassandra Project, a nationally recognized not-for-profit organization working to raise awareness and help individuals, families, and communities prepare for Y2K. If you do not have a coupon, or if you wish to order additional workbooks for $7.95 each, which include shipping and handling, you may order by calling 1-888-925-6554. or send your check or money order for $7.95 to Plan Y2K, 5721 Arapahoe Avenue, A2, Boulder, Colorado, 80303. To order on the web, go to www.plany2k.com. Quantity discounts are available. Feel safe and secure as Y2K approaches and order today. Remember, preparedness is your best insurance.